At 11:27 a.m., the room laughed with the kind of confidence only executives wearing six-figure watches could afford. By midnight, red alerts were reflecting off the glass walls of the operations floor. The cloud failover was dead silent, and somewhere inside a locked compliance vault sat a single updated password escrow record no one had bothered to read carefully. The conference room smelled faintly of burnt espresso and polished walnut, the scent of expensive decisions made too quickly. Screens glowed across the wall like miniature suns, bathing everyone in cold blue light, while rain pressed softly against the 32nd floor windows. Below, the city moved through another gray Tuesday, unaware that inside Argentum Dynamics, a single sentence had already cracked the foundation beneath a $220 million investor deal. Maya Torres stood near the edge of the presentation screen with a slim tablet in one hand and a backup access token clipped to her belt. She wore no power suit, no flashy jewelry, no polished executive smile, just a charcoal cardigan over a black blouse, sleeves rolled neatly to her elbows, the kind of person people overlooked until systems stopped breathing. The COO, Richard Vale, certainly overlooked her. "You just maintain servers," he interrupted, not even trying to lower his voice. "Let's not overcomplicate the investor walkthrough with technical paranoia." A few restrained laughs drifted around the table. Not cruel laughter. Worse, comfortable laughter. Maya's fingers tightened around the tablet, though her expression barely changed. She had spent 6 months building the company's disaster recovery architecture after a ransomware scare nearly destroyed a regional competitor. 6 months sleeping under fluorescent lights, 6 months documenting every contingency, every escalation path, every cloud failover dependency. And now Richard was waving her away like smoke. On the central monitor, the infrastructure map remained frozen mid-slide. Green clusters pulsed calmly across North America. Backup nodes in Oregon, failover orchestration in Toronto, escrow authentication vaults mirrored offshore. A digital nervous system stretched across continents. The lead investor from Blackridge Capital leaned forward slightly. "Actually," he said carefully, "I'd like to hear her finish." Richard smiled the way executives do when they're annoyed, but still performing politeness for money. "We're already over schedule." That tiny sentence shifted the air. Maya noticed it immediately. The investor noticed it too. Somewhere behind the glass walls, thunder rolled softly over the city. She inhaled once, steady and quiet. "Of course," she said. No argument, no humiliation visible on her face. That almost irritated Richard more. He adjusted his cufflinks and resumed talking about scalability projections and acquisition timelines while the room slowly forgot she was standing there. The investors nodded along to buzzwords dressed in tailored confidence: synergy, expansion, resilience, resilience. Maya nearly smiled at the irony, because 20 feet away from them sat a locked compliance terminal containing the password escrow update she had finalized that morning at 8:14 a.m. standard procedure. Every critical recovery credential had to be validated before investor migration testing. Standard procedure no one except her ever seemed to understand. Outside, rain streaked down the windows like ink running through paper. The demo continued. Then the first warning appeared. A tiny amber notification flashed on Maya's tablet. "Sync delay, secondary failover region." Her stomach tightened slightly, not panic, recognition. She tapped into the alert silently while Richard kept talking. "Data replication lag, minor. Correctable, except the timestamp bothered her. The Toronto node should have synchronized 40 minutes ago." Maya's eyes narrowed. Someone had postponed the overnight patch sequence. Someone unauthorized. She glanced toward DevOps Director Alan Pierce, sitting near the back of the room pretending to check email. He avoided eye contact immediately. Interesting, Richard was still talking. "And naturally, our redundancy systems are fully autonomous now." Maya almost laughed aloud. Autonomous. The system required a validated escrow chain to activate emergency cloud failover during catastrophic interruption. She personally designed it that way after legal requested human accountability protections. One final authorization layer, one secured key holder, her, only her. And suddenly she realized Richard had no idea. The investor beside the window raised an eyebrow. "Fully autonomous?" Richard nodded confidently. Maya watched the storm clouds darken behind him like a warning no one else could read. Another alert appeared. Escrow validation pending. That should not have been pending. Not during live synchronization. Not during investor review day. A cold stillness settled over her shoulders. She opened the validation logs. Her access credential remained active. Alan's temporary override attempt had failed 3 times. Now things made sense. Someone had tried bypassing compliance protocols before the meeting, probably to speed up migration metrics for the investor presentation. Executives loved shortcuts when deadlines threatened bonuses. But shortcuts in infrastructure were like hairline fractures in airplane wings, invisible right until gravity noticed. Richard finally turned toward her again, impatience flickering across his face. Maya, unless there's an actual emergency. The room looked at her, dozens of polished eyes waiting for her either to apologize or disappear. The rain intensified against the glass. Maya slowly locked her tablet screen. No emergency, she said calmly. That answer relaxed everyone except the investor from Blackridge. He studied her for 1 second too long, because he heard what she didn't say. The meeting ended 11 minutes later with handshakes, expensive pens, and promises about the future. Assistants gathered coffee cups, while executives floated into hallway conversations, already spending money they hadn't officially received yet. Richard stopped Maya near the door. "You have to stop undermining presentations with technical doom scenarios," he said quietly. "You're brilliant, but nobody invests in fear." She looked at him steadily. "Nobody survives without preparation either." His jaw flexed. For a brief second, the polished executive mask slipped, revealing irritation sharpened by insecurity. Then he smiled again. Corporate people always smiled right before making terrible decisions. "Well," he said lightly, "fortunately, we have leadership for that." The words landed softly, but soft things could still bruise. Maya nodded once, unclipped her security badge, and placed it carefully into his palm. Richard blinked. "What's this?" "My resignation." The hallway noise seemed to dim around them. Even Alan looked up from across the corridor. Richard gave a short laugh. "You're serious?" "I updated the password escrow records," Maya said. "Compliance has everything documented." A strange expression crossed Alan's face. Fear, tiny, brief, real. Richard barely noticed. "You're quitting because I interrupted you?" "No," Maya replied. "I'm leaving because nobody in this building listens until systems fail." For the first time all afternoon, silence truly entered the room. Not awkward silence, dangerous silence. Somewhere deep in the building, hidden beneath layers of glass architecture and climate-controlled server rooms, automated processes continued ticking toward midnight. Replication delays, pending validations, unauthorized override attempts, tiny invisible sparks drifting through dry forest. Maya picked up her coat. The investor from Blackridge happened to be exiting the elevator lobby just then. He glanced between her and Richard with quiet curiosity. Then his gaze dropped to the Resigned badge in Richard's hand. A flicker of concern crossed his face before the elevator doors closed. And suddenly, despite the warm lighting and expensive marble floors, the headquarters of Argentum Dynamics felt unbearably cold. By 6:42 p.m., the first silent failure began. But nobody upstairs noticed yet. And by the time they finally understood what Maya had been trying to warn them about, the investor deal would already be hanging over a cliff edge with nothing beneath it except gravity. If someone had opened the updated password escrow record before midnight, everything might have unfolded differently. At 9:13 p.m., the operations floor looked less like a technology company and more like the bridge of a ship drifting toward black water. Without realizing, the lighthouse had gone dark. Rows of monitors reflected across exhausted faces. The usual low murmur of keyboards and muted conversations had disappeared beneath the sterile hum of cooling fans. Outside the glass curtain walls, the storm had swallowed the skyline completely. Lightning flashed between skyscrapers and pale fractures, illuminating conference rooms where executives still celebrated too early. Near the network command center, Alan Pierce loosened his tie for the third time in 20 minutes. The replication lag had doubled. He stared at the dashboard with growing disbelief. Toronto secondary cluster, unstable. Oregon backup node, delayed synchronization. Cloud failover readiness, pending escrow authorization. Pending, still pending. A cold pulse moved through his chest. That field should have auto-cleared hours ago. Unless... He opened the compliance chain again and felt his stomach drop. Primary keyholder updated, Maya Torres. Richard had never bothered reading the final compliance packet she submitted that morning. He signed everything automatically between investor meetings. Alan remembered watching him initial documents while talking about stake reservations. Now the digital signatures stared back at him like loaded weapons. Alan muttered under his breath and reached for his phone. No answer. He called Maya again. straight to voicemail. Around him, engineers exchanged uneasy glances as warning notifications multiplied across the screens like spreading cracks in ice. One junior analyst spoke too loudly. "Why isn't failover armed?" Nobody answered, because everyone suddenly understood the same thing at once. The system wasn't broken, it was waiting for proper authorization exactly as Maya designed it. Rain hammered against the windows harder now, turning the city beyond into smeared rivers of white and gold light. Somewhere down the hall, an espresso machine hissed uselessly into the silence. Alan wiped sweat from his forehead. He remembered arguing with Maya 3 months earlier about escrow dependency requirements. "What if you're unavailable?" he had asked. "What if leadership bypasses safety protocols?" she replied. At the time, he thought she was being difficult. Now her caution felt almost prophetic. The elevator doors opened sharply. Richard Vale stepped onto the operations floor, still carrying the effortless confidence of a man who had never truly faced consequences. But the moment he saw the monitors, something changed in his expression. "What's happening?" Nobody answered fast enough. That alone terrified him. Alan finally stood. "The failover sequence isn't activating." Richard frowned. "Then activate it." Silence again. The room seemed to shrink around those words. Alan swallowed. "We can't." A flicker of irritation crossed Richard's face. "What does that mean?" "It means," Alan said carefully, "the escrow authorization key was reassigned this morning." Richard's jaw tightened. To who? But he already knew. You could see it in his eyes before Alan even spoke. "Maya." Lightning flashed across the windows, washing the room in white for half a second. Richard laughed once, short, sharp, disbelieving. "That's impossible." Alan rotated the monitor toward him. There it was, time-stamped, documented, legally validated, Maya Torres, Primary Escrow Authority. Richard stared at the screen as if refusing to process language itself. "She resigned." "Yes." "And nobody transferred access?" Alan said nothing, because technically the transfer process required executive approval and security witness verification. Procedures Richard himself delayed twice because he considered them administrative clutter. Now those postponed signatures sat like unexploded mines beneath the company. Across the floor, another alarm triggered, this time red. "Database replication failure?" A junior engineer cursed softly before catching himself. The atmosphere shifted instantly, no longer tense. Critical. People moved faster now. Chairs rolled backward. Commands snapped across terminals. Someone requested emergency vendor escalation. Another engineer initiated manual sync recovery and immediately hit authorization barriers. Every path led back to the same locked gate. "Maya." Richard pulled out his phone. Call failed. Again, again, again. The irony began creeping slowly through the room like smoke. Hours earlier, he had dismissed her in front of investors with a smile polished sharp enough to cut dignity in half. Now, a billion-dollar infrastructure environment was effectively kneeling before documentation he never bothered respecting. Outside, thunder rolled over the city with theatrical cruelty. At 10:41 p.m., Blackridge Capital requested a status update. Nobody wanted to answer it. The investor team had scheduled a final overnight stability review before authorizing the $220 million release at opening bell. Routine procedure. One last confirmation that Argentum's infrastructure could survive acquisition-scale traffic migration. Richard gathered executives into the glass conference room overlooking the operations floor. The same room, the same polished table, the same glowing skyline now drowned beneath rain and emergency alerts. Only the mood had changed. CFO Elena Brooks placed both hands flat against the table. "Tell me this isn't serious." Alan looked exhausted already. "It becomes serious if the primary environment fails before synchronization completes." "And what are the odds of that?" Nobody answered immediately, which was answer enough. Richard paced beside the windows. "Can legal override the escrow authority?" "No." "Can cybersecurity bypass it?" "No." "Can anyone in this building activate failover?" Alan hesitated, then quietly, "Not without Maya." The room fell still. Even the air conditioning seemed louder. Elena closed her eyes briefly. "You embarrassed the only person who understood the system." Richard snapped back immediately. "I did not embarrass. You interrupted her in front of investors." "She overcomplicated everything." "No," Elena said coldly. "She understood consequences." That landed harder than shouting would have. Richard stopped pacing. For the first time all evening, uncertainty crept visibly into his posture. Tiny at first, a loosened shoulder, an unfocused stare, the beginning of a crack. Below the conference room glass, engineers rushed between terminals beneath flashing alerts that painted the entire operations floor in red pulses like a heartbeat losing rhythm. Then came the next notification. Primary storage latency critical. Alan whispered something under his breath. What? Richard demanded. We're running out of time. The city lights flickered once beyond the storm. Inside the building, every executive suddenly remembered Maya standing quietly beside the presentation screen that morning while nobody listened. Not emotional, not dramatic, certain. That certainty frightened them now more than the outage itself. At 11:26 p.m., exactly 1 minute before the timestamp burned permanently into audit history, Blackridge Capital sent a formal notice. Investor release on hold pending infrastructure review. No one spoke for several seconds. The deal wasn't dead yet, but everyone in the room understood something irreversible had already happened. Trust, once cracked inside corporate walls, spread damage faster than fire through dry wiring. Richard stared at the message with hollow disbelief. $220 million balanced on a thread woven entirely from procedures he once called unnecessary. And somewhere out there in the rain-soaked city, Maya Torres had already walked away carrying nothing except her coat, her silence, and the quiet certainty that eventually the system would reveal who truly kept it alive. What terrified them most was not that she left. It was that she left correctly. And before sunrise, someone in that building was going to discover the final detail hidden inside the escrow update she filed at 8:14 that morning. Subscribe for the next chapter, because the real damage inside Argentum Dynamics hasn't even reached the boardroom yet. By 1:18 a.m., the headquarters of Argentum Dynamics no longer sounded like success. The building sounded mechanical, fragile, haunted. Emergency cooling units roared through the server corridors beneath the operations floor, filling the air with a low metallic vibration that seemed to settle directly into people's bones. Elevator chimes echoed through half-empty hallways. Somewhere near accounting, a forgotten phone rang endlessly before stopping mid-tone like it had given up waiting for human attention. The storm outside had finally weakened, but the city still glistened under sheets of rain, streets reflecting amber lights like broken circuitry. Inside Conference Room C, nobody had touched the catered food in hours. Coffee cups sat abandoned beside glowing laptops, while legal teams argued quietly over compliance language nobody usually read until disasters arrived carrying invoices. The expensive confidence from earlier that day had evaporated completely. Now executives looked pale beneath fluorescent lighting that suddenly felt too honest. Richard Vale stared through the glass wall at the operations floor below. Red alerts continued pulsing across giant monitoring screens. He hated those colors now. Every flash reminded him of Maya standing silently beside the investor presentation while he reduced her entire role to maintaining servers. The memory replayed with unbearable precision. Her expression, her calm voice, the way she resigned without anger. That part unsettled him most. People usually fought before leaving. Maya hadn't fought. She had documented, and somehow that felt infinitely more dangerous. Behind him, Elena Brooks closed another call with Blackridge Capital. They're freezing all transfer approvals until the morning audit. Richard rubbed both hands across his face. We still have time. Do we? Her tone carried no aggression now, only exhaustion. Across the table, corporate counsel Martin Green adjusted his glasses and opened the compliance archive again. Hundreds of procedural documents filled the screen in endless gray rows. Then he stopped scrolling. Wait. Nobody moved. Martin leaned closer. There's an addendum attached to the escrow reassignment. Alan looked up sharply. What addendum? Martin clicked the file. The room filled with silence as Maya's documentation appeared on screen. Timestamp 8:14 a.m. Subject, Emergency Failover Governance Clarification. Richard's chest tightened. Martin began reading aloud. In accordance with revised recovery policy, primary failover authorization may not be reassigned without completion of dual signature continuity verification and executive risk acknowledgement. Alan swore softly under his breath. Elena's eyes narrowed. Executive risk acknowledgement? Martin scrolled lower. There it was. Unsigned. Richard's missing approval. The room went still. Not because of the missing signature itself, because everyone suddenly understood what Maya had done. She had warned them, officially, legally, repeatedly, and Richard ignored it because he thought infrastructure compliance was background noise beneath executive strategy. The realization spread slowly across the room like cold water under a locked door. Richard pulled out a chair and sat down heavily for the first time all night. She knew this could happen. Alan looked at him carefully. I think she knew nobody was listening. Another alarm triggered downstairs, this one louder. A storage engineer hurried across the operations floor, holding printed diagnostics like emergency medical scans. The building's polished calm had disappeared entirely now, ties loosened, jackets abandoned, sleeves rolled up. The illusion of effortless leadership always collapsed quickly around real technical failure. At 1:47 a.m., Blackridge's lead investor Daniel Mercer arrived in person. No announcement, no entourage, just a dark overcoat still wet from rain, and the expression of a man who had built enough companies to recognize the smell of preventable disaster. The operations floor quieted almost immediately when he stepped off the elevator. Executives moved toward him too fast, smiling too carefully. Daniel ignored most of them. What's the actual situation? Nobody answered immediately. Again, always silence first during real crises. Alan finally spoke. Failover synchronization remains incomplete due to escrow authorization lock. Daniel nodded once. The engineer who resigned? Not a question. Richard stepped forward. We're resolving it. Daniel looked at him for several seconds before speaking again. How many people understood this system deeply enough to rebuild authorization manually? Alan hesitated. One. The investor's gaze shifted slowly. Maya. Another silence. Daniel exhaled quietly through his nose. That's what I thought. He walked toward the giant monitoring wall, while reflected alerts flickered across the glass in restless crimson waves. For a long moment, he simply watched the dashboards. Then he asked the question nobody else wanted to say aloud. Did she leave because she was ignored? Richard tried answering immediately. This is being exaggerated. She resigned during the investor demo. Elena interrupted flatly. Daniel turned. The disappointment in his face was worse than anger. In finance, anger could still negotiate. Disappointment usually meant calculations had already changed. I asked to hear her presentation, Daniel said quietly. Richard said nothing. Outside the windows, the storm clouds had finally begun breaking apart, revealing thin fragments of moonlight over the city skyline. But inside Argentum Dynamics, the atmosphere only darkened. Because now the investors understood something catastrophic that technical alerts alone could never fully explain. The infrastructure wasn't failing because of software. It was failing because leadership dismissed the person holding it together. At 2:26 a.m., another discovery surfaced. One of the cybersecurity analysts found Maya's final internal ticket submission. Priority level, high. Subject, executive override exposure risk. Opened 3 weeks earlier, closed automatically without review. Assigned executive approver, Richard Vale. The room became so quiet, even keyboard clicks sounded intrusive. Richard stared at the screen. Memory returned in fragments now. Endless meetings, fast approvals, ignored compliance notices buried between acquisition calls and investor dinners. He remembered forwarding one of Maya's escalation emails with a sarcastic comment, another apocalypse warning from infrastructure. Alan saw the color drain from his face. For the first time that night, Richard looked genuinely afraid, not of losing money, of realizing he had publicly diminished the very person preventing catastrophe behind the scenes while taking credit above it. The building lights flickered once. Everyone looked up instantly. Operations engineers froze, then backup power stabilized. Barely. Alan inhaled sharply. Storage replication is collapsing faster now. Daniel Mercer folded his arms slowly. Can the company survive until morning? Nobody answered immediately. Because survival suddenly depended on variables spreadsheets could not measure, trust, competence, respect, and whether the one person who truly understood the system had any reason left to help them at all. Somewhere across the sleeping city, Maya Torres sat awake beneath completely different lighting, unaware that inside Argentum's glass tower, executives were finally beginning to read the warnings she had spent months writing. And before dawn arrived, Richard Vale was going to uncover the final sentence buried at the bottom of her last compliance report, the sentence that would quietly determine who carried legal responsibility for everything happening now. At 3:11 a.m., exhaustion settled over Argentum Dynamics like dust after a collapse. The glamorous edges of the company had disappeared completely by then. No polished investor smiles, no rehearsed leadership language, just tired people moving through cold blue light while machines counted down consequences with perfect indifference. The operations floor smelled of stale coffee, overheated electronics, and rain-damp fabric. Somewhere near the server access corridor, an exhausted engineer quietly threw up into a trash can and returned to his terminal 30 seconds later without a word. That was the thing about infrastructure disasters. They stripped titles first. By now, nobody cared who was vice president of strategy. They cared who could stop the bleeding. And the terrifying answer remained the same: not here. Richard Vale stood alone inside his office overlooking the city. The skyline beyond the windows looked washed hollow beneath the fading storm, towers glowing like distant ships drifting through fog. His reflection hovered faintly in the glass, expensive suit wrinkled now, tie hanging loose, confidence eroded hour by hour. On his desk sat Maya's final compliance report. He had read it 4 times already. The last paragraph still felt unreal. In the event executive management declines continuity acknowledgement, operational liability transfers to approving officers under revised governance policy. Richard swallowed hard. Below that sentence sat his digital approval trail, time-stamped, verified, legally binding. His chest tightened. For years, he treated infrastructure documentation like background static beneath real business. Something technical people exaggerated to justify caution. He built his career on velocity, fast acquisitions, fast scaling, fast decisions. Investors loved confidence. Boards rewarded momentum. And now every rushed signature was returning like unpaid debt. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Elena entered without waiting. "You should see this." Her voice carried none of its usual sharpness anymore. Fatigue had sanded everyone down to honesty. Richard followed her back toward the operations floor, where clusters of engineers stood around the main dashboard in uneasy silence. Alan noticed them approaching. "We found the root trigger." The words landed heavily. Richard stared at the screen. A timeline filled the display. 2214, unauthorized override attempt. 2216, escrow validation freeze. 2243, replication inconsistency escalation. 2302, automatic failover lockout. Each event connected like fractures spreading through glass. Alan zoomed further in. The override credentials appeared. Temporary executive authorization request. Requested by R. Vale. Richard blinked slowly. "What?" Alan looked exhausted. "Your office requested accelerated synchronization bypass yesterday afternoon." "That's impossible." Elena crossed her arms. "You asked for migration speed improvements before the investor audit?" Memories surfaced immediately. A rushed conversation before lunch. Him complaining that the backup synchronization window made the demo metrics look sluggish. Someone from operations suggesting a temporary optimization path. Richard approving it while barely listening. At the time, it felt insignificant. Now that tiny shortcut sat at the center of a multi-million-dollar disaster like a lit match beside gasoline. "Nobody said this could happen," he muttered. Alan's expression darkened slightly. "Maya did." Silence again. That name moved through rooms differently now, not with irritation, with gravity. Across the floor, engineers continued fighting to stabilize systems manually, while investors monitored everything remotely through emergency audit access. Every blinking alert felt exposed now, as though the company's polished exterior had been peeled back to reveal rushed decisions hidden beneath investor presentations and quarterly optimism. At 3:48 a.m., Blackridge Capital officially suspended final acquisition review. The notification arrived quietly. No dramatic sound, no flashing screen, just a simple legal email appearing across executive devices. Yet somehow it felt louder than every alarm combined. Elena read it once and lowered her phone. "They're invoking operational uncertainty clauses?" Richard leaned against the conference table slowly. "How bad?" Daniel Mercer answered from the doorway before anyone else could speak. "Bad enough that the board will ask whether leadership negligence created material risk exposure." No one noticed him arrive. He stepped inside carrying another coffee, no longer hot enough to steam. The investor looked less angry now, which was somehow worse. Anger implied emotion. This expression looked analytical, measured, like a man recalculating value in real time. Daniel placed a folder onto the table. Inside were printed copies of Maya's ignored escalation notices. Weeks of them. Detailed, structured, professional. Every warning time-stamped. Every recommendation documented. Every risk clearly explained. Richard stared at the pages in disbelief. "She copied legal?" "She copied everyone," Daniel replied quietly. "You just stopped reading?" The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. Outside the conference room, emergency maintenance teams rolled equipment carts through the hallway, while security guards whispered near elevators. Rumors had already spread through the company. Employees from marketing and finance were suddenly awake at 4 a.m, refreshing internal channels, and wondering whether Argentum was collapsing in real time. Corporate disasters always traveled faster than official statements. Daniel sat down slowly across from Richard. Do you know why investors pay attention to engineers like Maya? Richard said nothing. Because systems don't care about charisma, Daniel continued. Servers don't react to confidence. Infrastructure doesn't respond to titles. Reality only responds to competence. Each sentence landed with quiet precision. And the moment critical people realize they're invisible, he added, they stop protecting companies from themselves. Richard looked toward the darkened operations floor. For the first time in years, he noticed details he had ignored daily. The overnight engineers sleeping in chairs during deployment weekends, the handwritten troubleshooting notes taped beside terminals, the half-empty energy drink cans near monitoring stations, tiny invisible rituals keeping billion-dollar systems alive, while executives upstairs discussed growth charts beneath warm, catered lighting. Maya had belonged to that invisible world, and he reduced her to maintaining servers. The humiliation of that realization settled slowly into his chest. At 4:22 a.m., Alan approached carrying another printed report. His face had changed too over the night. Less defensive now, more honest. We manage partial stabilization, he said carefully, but the failover chain still can't fully recover without escrow confirmation. Daniel looked up. Meaning? Alan hesitated. If the primary cluster drops before synchronization completes, he exhaled softly, we lose transactional continuity. Even the air seemed thinner after that sentence. Legal liability, regulatory investigations, investor withdrawal, public reputation damage, the consequences spread outward in everyone's imagination simultaneously, like cracks racing beneath ice. Richard sank into a chair. What would Maya have done? Nobody answered immediately, because deep down, they all knew the painful truth. Maya already told them exactly what to do. They just dismissed her before listening long enough to understand. And somewhere inside the endless chain of audit logs, legal records, and ignored escalation tickets, one final automated message was still waiting to be opened. A message scheduled by Maya hours before she resigned. By sunrise, every executive in Argentum Dynamics would receive it simultaneously. At 6:03 a.m., dawn arrived quietly over the city. The storm had passed, but the glass tower of Argentum Dynamics still looked stranded beneath a sky the color of wet concrete. Morning light crept slowly across empty conference rooms and exhausted faces, exposing every coffee stain, every loosened tie, every sleepless hour hidden beneath executive composure. The building felt older now, as if one night had aged it years. On the operations floor, engineers moved with the numb precision of people surviving on adrenaline alone. Monitoring screens still glowed amber and red, but the violent chaos from midnight had settled into something colder. Consequences. At exactly 6:14 a.m., every executive phone inside Argentum vibrated simultaneously. One notification, one sender, Maya Torres. The room froze almost instantly. Richard stared at his screen without opening the message for several seconds. Around him, others had already gone pale beneath the early morning light. Subject line, continuity acknowledgement, final automated notice. No one spoke. Even the operations floor seemed quieter somehow, as if the entire building understood this moment mattered. Richard finally opened it. The email was short, professional, precise. Per governance policy, this notice confirms that all continuity risks related to escrow authorization, cloud failover dependency, and executive override exposure were formally documented prior to my resignation. Below that sat 13 attached files: escalation reports, compliance notices, security recommendations, unreviewed risk assessments, every ignored warning carefully preserved in chronological order like sealed evidence. Then came the final paragraph. Infrastructure resilience depends not only on systems, but on whether the people maintaining them are heard before failure makes them visible. No accusation, no anger, no threat, and somehow that made it devastating. The conference room remained silent long after people finished reading, because there was nothing left to argue with. The truth was time-stamped, verified, legally untouchable. Richard lowered his phone slowly. Outside the windows, sunlight finally broke through the clouds in thin, pale streaks across the skyline. The city below resumed its ordinary rhythm. Commuters crossing intersections, delivery trucks rattling through wet streets, cafe lights flickering awake. Normal life continuing while inside Argentum Dynamics, careers quietly shifted direction forever. Daniel Mercer closed the email and looked toward Richard. You know what the board will ask first. Richard nodded faintly. Why were the warnings ignored? Not why the systems failed. Not why failover stalled, why the person warning them stopped being heard. That distinction mattered now more than anything technical. Across the operations floor, Alan sat heavily beside a terminal and rubbed both hands across his face. He looked like someone who had survived a fire only to realize the building itself had been designed carelessly from the start. One junior engineer approached cautiously. "Sir, the stabilization held." Alan blinked once. "What?" Primary clusters recovered synchronization at 5:58. For the first time in hours, nobody moved. Then slowly, carefully, breaths released around the room. Not celebration, relief. The company wasn't dead. Damaged, yes. Exposed, absolutely. But alive? Barely. Elena closed her eyes for one exhausted second before leaning back into her chair. "The deal?" Daniel answered honestly. "Blackridge will delay final approval pending governance review." Translation. Everything had changed. Investors could survive technical incidents. What frightened them was leadership blindness. And that blindness now sat documented across legal archives, audit trails, and Maya's final automated notice. Richard walked slowly toward the giant operations window overlooking the waking city. For years, he believed leadership meant speaking confidently enough that uncertainty disappeared around you. He thought authority naturally outweighed caution, that technical people worried too much. That speed solved hesitation. Now he understood something painfully simple. The strongest systems in the building had not failed because they were weak. They failed because someone underestimated the person quietly holding the map. Behind him, legal teams were already preparing emergency governance reviews. HR executives whispered about internal restructuring. Security officers coordinated audit preservation requests. The machinery of corporate survival had activated, cold, efficient, hungry for accountability. And for the first time in his career, Richard Vail was no longer certain he would survive inside it. At 7:02 a.m., another message arrived. This one from Maya directly to Human Resources, short, formal, requesting confirmation that her resignation, escrow transfer documentation, and compliance notices had been fully archived. Nothing emotional, nothing dramatic, just closure. Elena read it over Richard's shoulder. "She's making sure the records stay preserved." Richard gave a hollow laugh. "She's still protecting the company." Daniel looked at him carefully. "No," he said quietly. "She's protecting herself from the company." That sentence settled into the room with brutal clarity, because everyone finally understood the same thing. Maya never sabotaged Argentum Dynamics. She simply stopped shielding it from the consequences of ignoring her. And once that protection disappeared, the company revealed its fractures all by itself. Hours later, employees would arrive carrying coffees and laptops, unaware how close the company had come to disaster overnight. Rumors would spread, internal investigations would begin, leadership meetings would stretch for weeks beneath polished language about accountability and operational culture. But the people inside the operations floor would remember something much simpler. A woman stood in a conference room at 11:27 a.m., tried to explain a risk, and was interrupted by someone too confident to listen. By sunrise, that single interruption had cost more than money could comfortably measure. And somewhere beyond the glass towers and legal reviews and investor negotiations, Maya Torres finally slept peacefully for the first time in months, while the system she built continued running exactly as designed.